into the those 4 Department of Justice manual, letterhead, Department of Justice, United States of America. That despicable text. It's got to be the worst text I've encountered. Bob, did you want to introduce me, or do I just introduce myself, or what? I just started here. Thank you.
I think you've done a good job, Ray McGovern, who's visiting us in Grand Tour for Apply for Truth. And Ray has background, I guess, CIA, analyst, Vietnam War background. I'll leave that to you, Ray.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to be talking about dismal stuff here, but I have some good news first that might pick up your spirits. On the way, you probably haven't heard this yet, but on the way here we had the announcement that Osama bin Laden surrendered and confessed and was forgiven for his sins and ended up in heaven yesterday afternoon, just as St. Peter was sort of closing up shop, you know. Friday afternoon, he's putting the stuff in. And he sees this very tall fellow with white flowing garments coming up the hill. And I said, God, that looks like something. But luckily, St. Peter goes by book, of course. So I went over to his book, and sure enough, there was this light entry. Osama bin Laden has given himself up, has confessed, been forgiven. He immediately had a heart attack, and he's welcomed into heaven. St. Peter makes sure he feels very welcome. So St. Peter breathes a sigh of relief, and he says, Osama bin Laden's right there. He says, are you Osama? Who do you think I am? Says in Arabic. You know? So St. Peter says, well, welcome. You're most welcome here. I'd like you to meet some folks. Come on through this little entryway here. Oh, there's George Washington over there. Patrick Henry. James Madison. Thomas Jefferson. I'd like you to meet these folks. Which, translated from the Arabic, means, where are my virgins? And St. Peter said, oh, I'm awfully sorry. You didn't get word about that garble? It wasn't virgins, it was Virginians. Sorry about that. But the topic I was given here, intelligence and torture, is such an oxymoron that I thought I would start out with a moronic joke. On a more serious note, I would like to start out with one of my favorite prophets. His name is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and this is what he said. He was talking about evil. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most here would agree with what I learned in philosophy and theology, that there is a category of evil. We call it intrinsic evil, always wrong, into which you put slavery, rape, and torture. Torture fit that category. So we'll talk about evil here, and we'll be talking about the manifestations of evil and how it all got authorized and implemented. Let's remember that we're talking about evil here, and that's what Martin Luther King Jr. is also talking about. He says, non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as cooperation with good. We shall appeal also to the heart and conscience of you Americans. And then we shall win you in the process, and our victory will be a double victory. Let me just append a remark here, because I think there's a distinctly American characteristic which we have to kind of rise above, and that is not many of us consider it useful or practical or even smart to do anything without thinking that there's a reasonable prospect of our being successful. Or most of us would say, a probable prospect of being successful. My favorite quotation that bears on that comes from Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. where the good Bishop Bienvenu, remember the story? He says he gave Jean Valjean the candlesticks, and he's talking about, or Hugo was talking about, how success is what Victor Hugo calls an ugly term. See, Bishop Bienvenu was not successful. He was such a non-self-promoter that he had trouble getting priests to wear his diocese. Nobody wanted to be associated with Bienvenu because he wasn't going anywhere. And so this is what Hugo says, yes, success. It's an ugly term because far too often people confuse it with merit. Now, you may be the only person in the world that really rings for. But I think, you know, we can realize that we're meritorious or we're doing the right thing, even though it may be a prospect that we're not going to be successful. The good is worth doing because it is good. And it may be just our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. And I have 8 grandchildren now, no great-grandchildren that I know of. But, you know, it may be they who will ultimately prosper or have a better life because of the work that we do. So I want to start out talking about the torture authorized by the President of the United States, George W. Bush, in our name. How did it all start? We have a whole hour here, I think, so maybe I'll take up the first half and then we'll have questions and answers, or would you like me to take up less, 20 minutes or so? Okay, we'll do half and half. On the 9th of September 2001, our President, George W. Bush at the time, gave a speech to the nation after the disastrous events of 9/11. And then after that, he went down to the bowels of the White House, where he'd never been before, the so-called bunker. And there he met with Richard Clark, the anti-terrorist czar, and Don Rumsfeld, and George Tenet, a couple other folks. And someone raised the notion of striking Iraq, and someone else said, well, you know, Iraq, it was Al-Qaeda. And somebody else said, well, you know, it's sort of against the international law to strike a country. And Bush, according to Clark, who was there, folks, I mean, this is not secondhand, this is Clark writing in his book, Bush said, I don't care what the international lawyers say, we're going to kick some ass. The following evening, and this is less well known, the president was wandering around in the Situation Room in the White House. And he grabs Clark, a couple of his people, brings him into the room, and he says, was it Saddam Hussein? Was it Saddam Hussein? And Clark says that he stared in disbelief for a second and very courteously said, no, sir, you remember me telling you yesterday that it was Osama bin Laden, it was Al-Qaeda, and they don't have anything to do with Saddam Hussein, with all over all that. And he said, well, I want you to look at every bit of influence, every bit of intelligence, every bit of information. I want you to come back to that. I want you to tell me whether it was Saddam Hussein. And Clark respectfully said, yes, sir, we'll do that once again. And as the president walked out of that room, another of Clark's staffers came in and looked at the president and looked at Clark and the others with their mouths wide open, and said, what just happened here? And one of his staffers said, Wolfowitz has gotten to the president. So, you know, that's the background. That's how it all started. Next thing you know, we have George Tenet talking to the president. Now, I wasn't in the White House at the time. I used to be in there every other morning. But I know how these things work, okay? And here's George Tenet on the receiving end of this from the president. You got some guys there? You got some guys there out at Langley that can do this kind of stuff? We got to be harsh with these guys who are going into Afghanistan and then Iraq. We need some guys that can really do these harsh techniques. You got some guys? And Tenet says, well,